This project starts off with 4-foot long boards that are 1 3/4 to 2 inches in width. I picked 4 different kinds of wood for this bowl. Here are the lengths of the wedges, those that from the longest point. They increase at increments of 3/8 of an inch. When you're cutting the wedges, it is extremely important to use a stop block. I clamp my stop block on with a C-clamp, not a squeeze clamp, but a C-clamp. The angle I chose to use was 22.5 degrees. So basically you push your piece up to the stop block after cutting one angle, make your cut, and then you flip it over. Notice that your hand can be past the margin of safety still. You do not want to ever get your hand too close to the blade. Now you start to glue these pieces together using the Merle corner clamps. So the first thing I do is set up the clamp, and you can watch me here how I make adjustments to the clamp to try to dry fit this before I add any glue. This will eliminate a lot of frustration. If you get glue on all these and then you try to dry fit this will turn into a very, very frustrating experience. But if you take your time and set this up before you put any glue on, it isn't so bad. So you notice on the clamp, there's 2 big adjustments. One is the red handle and the other one is the silver lever. So you just make big adjustments with the silver lever and then small adjustments with the red handle on the clamp. So now you'll see me, I'm sliding those around. I'm using 8 corners. Now I've locked the lever, the silver lever, and now I'm adjusting the red clamp, the red handle to make this tight. So when I get this good, I never touch that silver lever again. I just loosen the red handle. So you see I loosen the red handle, and now I can apply my glue. So there's lots of ways you could apply the glue. This is the way I chose to do it. So sometimes I'll lay those all together and I'll apply glue to every single piece at the same time. You can use a glue spreader or a roller. But this is the way that I chose to do it today. So there's lots of different ways you could apply this. You want a liberal amount of glue on this because these are open pores. The end grain has open pores and it's really going to soak in the glue pretty well. So you'd be better off using a little too much glue on this step than not using enough. Now I will caution you, if you use too much glue, it does make the pieces tend to slip around a lot more. So I'm doing this on an old countertop, so that way I'm not picking up dirt or any fragments off the countertop, plus I'm not going to stick to it. So I don't normally recommend doing this with paper underneath. It does protect the work surface nice, but the paper will get stuck in between the segments. So I'm trying for a pattern here. On this pattern, I think I chose walnut oak, maple cherry, walnut oak, maple cherry for an octagonal fit here. So then I have to do the bottom. The bottom pieces are 3 3/4 in width. And then basically I am setting up my miter box again to 22.5, and I'm just cutting to the point of these pieces. So I'm just making a triangle. I have to make sure my cut goes all the way to the point, and then I just flip it over and then I do another one. So with these bowls, there really isn't that much waste because you're always flipping the piece over. You're not cutting the angle back and forth, you just flip it over. And that applies to the bottom as well. So you'll see I'm going to hold this up and you can kind of see I cut right to the point. There's no real specific measurement that it has to be on the length. You just have to make sure it hits the point. So then I glue these together as well. So all the segments kind of get glued together as well. Sometimes, I'm not sanding any of these miters, by the way. I'm not sanding them on a disc sander, edge sander, nothing. Because my miter box is going to produce a really nice clean cut if I have a decent blade on it. Now with that being said, especially on the bottom layer, sometimes you will end up with a tiny gap if your miter box isn't set perfectly. So in that case, what I do is when I'm dry fitting, I notice the problem, and then maybe you just glue it up in sets of 4. So you have 2 halves of the circle. And then once those 2 halves set up, you just don't put glue in the middle. Then you can sand those halves flat on the edge sander and then just glue together that last joint. So sometimes that will happen if they don't fit perfectly. It's more common on the bottom layer than it is any of the other layers. But But remember, usually trying to sand these only makes it worse unless you're really precise and really careful. Usually just being really careful with your boards when you're cutting them on the miter box, making sure they're against the fence will do the trick. So now you can kind of get a little closer look at this, all glued up. All right, now it's time to sand them on the wide belt sander. You're going to sand both faces until they're nice and smooth. If you don't have access to a wide belt sander, you can also orbit sand them carefully. All right, now it's time to glue up the layers. First, I take my time marking them. I marked the first layer out 1.5 inches, and then I kind of subtracted 1/8 of an inch as I twisted the layers and stacked them up. So each layer was staggered 1/8 of an inch less than the previous layer. And then I made a nice mark there afterwards to help me know what's going on. So I traced all those pieces, and then I made a mark, a vertical mark as well. So then when I'm gluing this together, I'm looking for the vertical mark and then the trace marks. So then gluing these together, I usually do not double spread these. I make just one spread of glue, and then I make sure I get an ample amount of glue. I notice a lot of times when you're double spreading them, it almost gets too much glue, and then they slide around so much it's really hard to clamp. So you're trying to get a precise amount of glue that's going to coat both sides. I'm making quite a mess here, really. A small foam roller would work really nice here. But I'm just using a thin piece of wood to try to spread this out, also using my fingers. And you're going to get this on your fingers, so go ahead and make sure you don't walk away from this. You get this all done before you walk away, because you do not want the glue to skin over. And that's going to happen if you go wash your hands in the middle of this. So try to power through this. If you get a little glue on your fingers or your clothes, you can wash that out. But you're really trying to laminate all these stacks now all at once, and you're trying to work really fast. So I just had one layer done. Now I'm going to move on. I'm adding just a little bit more. Now I'm going to move on to my second layer. And so I'm just going to drop that second layer down now, and I'm going to try to look for my pencil marks, because that's really important. I can't stress enough how important this step is. If you do not line these layers up correctly, if they're off, it's going to multiply. So if you're off 1/4 inch, if they slip 1/4 inch, you're going to be off 1/2 inch. And that's where, when you go to spin it, if it's off 1/2 inch, it's really going to wobble bad, and your bowl's going to be a lot thinner, and you might even have to cut away a couple layers. So right now, this is a 5-layer bowl, and if it gets too off too far, if these are not centered, these laminations, then it might turn into a 3-layer bowl. So you really have to do a good job on this step, and I've seen a lot of times where this step doesn't go well, and then it really downfalls from there. So take your time on this step and do a really good job trying to make this happen right. So I'm just working my way through these layers, trying to add ample amount of glue, but not so much glue that it's going to slide around a ton. I'm using a piece of plywood now to help with the clamping. I'm putting down a layer of paper because I don't want this to stick to the plywood. So the plywood is just a little bit bigger than the bowl. I have a piece for the top and a piece for the bottom. I'm trying to align my layers again really good, trying to look for my pencil marks the best I can to line everything up. Looking down from the center just to double check everything. And then I can put my top board on. I'm going to need some paper for the top board as well, because I don't want that to stick either. So grabbing a piece of paper for the top board could pay off later if you need to. And you'll see me grab a piece for that as well. So then I have a piece on the top and a piece on the bottom. Now I'm going to work my clamps in. This is going to take 4 clamps to do this right, but I'm going to start off with just using 2. You want to use some really nice parallel clamps for this. Take your time. Doing a good job here again, because like I said, the clamping and gluing of this step is really critical to this turning out. So I'm going to slide one in, and now you're going to have to keep double checking this, because these layers are going to want to move around as you're clamping these together. So once you get 2 clamps on, you need to look at your pencil marks and see if this is good to go, or if it's moved on you. If it's moved on you, you can usually just loosen the clamps a tiny bit and slide the layers back to where they're supposed to be, real gently, without removing the clamps completely. So I'm just kind of looking in there. I think I saw one move just a little bit, so I slid it over just a little more. And just really take your time and look at that. So, just like on any project, the more clamps, the better. So if you walk away and just leave 2 clamps on this, it's going to do a decent job. But you're going to be spinning this on the lathe at high RPMs. You don't want this thing to disintegrate on you. So taking the time to add 2 more clamps is going to pay off. Make the joints a little tighter, make them look better, plus help protect it while you're, spinning this thing. So I'm going to put 2 more clamps on there, and then I think I'm going to be about ready to go. I might wipe off a little extra glue just to make this a little bit cleaner of a project. So here's just kind of a quick overview of how this turned out. Once I clamped it, you can kind of see some of the glue squirting out. That's a perfect amount of glue there. And you can kind of see all my pencil marks. My pieces are evenly spaced, and that turned out good. So now it's time to get the piece ready for the faceplate. So I just took the faceplate, traced it onto a piece of hardwood. You don't want to use pine for this. This is a piece of thick poplar. And then I'm just going to, instead of trying to cut this piece that's so close to the blade, I'm cutting this off a longer piece to be safe. So my hand should never get too close to the blade on this. I should never breach the margin of safety. And this way, this will help me. So my board is plenty long enough so I can keep my hands far back. And I'm just notching this piece, and then I'll cut it off as scrap. And that way my hands never had to have any danger getting close to that big bandsaw blade. So that is the safest way to make this block of wood. And this part doesn't have to be perfect. This is the part you're just trying to knock off those corners, so if you do bump it on a tool, it's not so drastic. It doesn't have to be perfect. So there's my waste piece. That's really my good piece. So then I can just kind of make sure it fits the faceplate. I'm going to drill 1 hole in the center of that, and the hole will be used to help center onto my bowl. So my bowl's dry for 24 hours. I put the plate on there, the wooden plate, and I center it through that hole. I'm looking for the center point. And then I clamp this. All right, I've let that block of wood glue for 24 hours. Now I'm installing the metal faceplate with some long screws. And then time to start turning. So I'm going to turn the outside first at pretty low RPMs. I'm just using a small round nose tool for this. And there's a lot of opinions online of what the best tool is to use for this. I like to pick one that has a little less surface area, especially when I'm roughing the bowl. It just turns out to be a little more pleasant that way. If you use a really big tool, you're going to get some really big gouges, and you're going to get a lot of chunks flying off. And this is just the way I prefer to do it. There's a lot of different opinions on this, but I just have a nice sharp round nose, and I just keep working my tool rest in as I go. I want it as close to the workpiece as possible. My goal here is to do a shear cut, so I'm trying to work from side to side, not so much head on to this thing. The shear cut is really going to produce a much better, smoother cut than just trying to go right at it straight on. So that's what I'm doing here. Your shaving should be really curly. So I'm getting really curly shavings off this. That means my tool is really sharp. If you start noticing a lot of chips, that means your tool isn't as sharp. I don't wear gloves for this. I don't feel like it's safe to wear gloves. And you could wear some tight-fitting tight-fitting rubber gloves, but probably not leather gloves or anything that could get pinched in there with the tool rest. So some people do not like the chips hitting their hands or their fingers, and really it's not too bad if your bowl is centered well. So here you can see some of the curly shavings. I still have some spots, I have some flat spots, but mostly I'm just about there. So when you start to fine tune this, you're just trying to shave off just a tiny bit of a time to where that will really reduce your sanding. So you're trying not to hog off too much material as you really start to fine tune this. If you just go a tiny bit of material at a time, just barely shaving it, it will really serve you well. You'll cut your sanding time down to hardly anything. So I've noticed over the past, when I really take my time carving with a sharp tool, it really eliminates an hour worth of sanding or more. So that's kind of what I aim to do here. I'm just trying to take off less and less as I fine tune this thing. So you can see those shavings just pile up. This is a very sharp tool. I'm not using leather or anything really crazy to sharpen this tool. I'm just using a fine grinding stone to do this. So I don't spend a lot of time sharpening blade tools like some people do, which is fine. I'm sure that serves them well. But I've found that, just a really precise, quick sharpening more often does a really good job. I don't overheat the tool though when I'm sharpening. I try to go easy on that. So now you'll see just another angle of how I'm holding the tool and how I'm just shaving just a real slight amount off to really fine tune this. As the bowl becomes smoother to work with, you can increase the RPMs accordingly. Now it's time to move on to the inside of the bowl. There's nothing really extraordinary to the inside that's different than the outside. Adjusting the tool rest to the correct cutting angle is probably a big thing to make sure you get right. And then once again, I'm just trying to really easily hit some of the high points to help make the bowl more stable. So I'm just barely taking off the corners, just gently working my way from layer to layer, trying to round off those corners to where it becomes more stable. I get less chipping. Once the inside of the bowl is nearly done, you can take a parting tool and make a relief or kerf between the sacrificial block of wood and the bottom of the bowl. So the goal here is just to remove some of that wood, to clean up the bottom of the bowl slightly, and basically just make that a little easier to remove later on. So I'm not digging in really deep here. I'm just kind of going back and forth nice and easy. And I'm trying to, reduce the diameter of this sacrificial piece of wood on the bottom. So for this, I'm just using a parting tool. I'm trying to take it easy to reduce friction. I'm going back and forth a little bit to widen it out. And you might have to sharpen this a couple times in this process because it is fairly aggressive on the tool. Now it's time to do some sanding. So when I sand these bowls, it all depends on how good a job I did with the carving. Sometimes I've done such a good job on the carving that I can start with about a 120 grit sandpaper. If there's a lot of deep gouges or defects that I'm trying to get out, I might have to start at like 60 grit. But this bowl turned out so nice, I started right at 120 grit sandpaper, and then I worked myself up to around 300 grit. Now I want to show you this bowl. This is another bowl, and this one did not glue up as good. It slipped on me, and I kind of rushed the glue up. So this one is off center quite a bit. So it's off center over a ½ inch, and this kind of helps show you how bad this is when it's off center. So it's a lot less pleasant to carve when it's way off center, and it chips a lot more. And then the bowl is going to be smaller. So the bowl will be smaller because you have to remove more material to get it centered, so to speak. So that's why when you're gluing this up, it's so important to do a really good job gluing this up. You can probably hear some of the chips coming off this bowl, and you have to go at a lot slower RPM as well. Alright, so now here's a look at the bowls here, and I'm about ready to put a finish on. I just want to show you the differences first. You know, one's been carved out and the other one is still in segments. It's just kind of a neat view to see the differences and how much wood is removed. I'm going to apply the first 2 coats of finish with a brush, and I will be sanding between coats. Right here on the lathe, I'll use a fine grit sandpaper to sand in between the coats on the lathe. Alright, because I did not use a paper joint on this bowl, and I don't necessarily recommend paper joints unless you're really experienced, I decided I've been using this method to take the sacrificial block off the bowl, and it does work very good, but you do have to be very careful. I do this for my students, this step, and you just have to really go easy, and don't bind the blade, and it comes off nice. So then I'm going to sand the bottom with an orbit sander usually, and then apply some more finish. This time it'll be a spray finish to finish it off.